In the late 1970s, California was growing outward. New streets appeared where open land had been. Rows of homes stood shoulder to shoulder, each with trimmed lawns, driveways, porch lights, and the quiet promise of safety. These were places built for families, for evenings spent indoors, for routines that felt dependable. The suburbs were meant to be predictable. They were designed around the idea that danger stayed elsewhere. And then, without warning, something began to change. It didn't announce itself. There were no sirens at first, no single event that made headlines across the state. Instead, there were small disturbances, reported quietly, discussed cautiously, sometimes dismissed as isolated incidents. A door found open, a light turned on where no one remembered leaving it, a household shaken by an intrusion that didn't quite make sense. At first, these moments seemed unconnected. Different towns, different streets, different families. But the feeling was the same. By the mid to late 1970s, California's expanding neighborhoods shared more than architectural styles and school districts. They shared an unease that could not yet be named. Something was moving through these communities, leaving behind confusion rather than clarity. The events did not look dramatic from the outside. There was no single image that explained what was happening, and that was part of what made it unsettling. People locked their doors the way they always had. They followed their routines. They trusted their surroundings. But slowly, a question began to circulate, not spoken loudly, not always shared with neighbors, but present all the same. How could something be wrong when everything looked normal? The incidents followed a pattern that was hard to define at the time. Homes were entered, boundaries were crossed, ordinary spaces were disturbed. And yet, there was no obvious sign pointing to who was responsible or how far this might spread. Law enforcement agencies handled reports locally as they were trained to do. Each case was examined on its own. No one yet understood they were pieces of a much larger picture. California in the 1970s was not prepared for a threat that blended into everyday life. These were not remote areas or abandoned places. These were lived-in neighborhoods, places where people waved to neighbors and parked their cars in open driveways. The idea that danger could exist here, quietly, repeatedly, challenged everything these communities believed about safety. The fear did not arrive all at once. It arrived in conversations after dinner, in porch lights left on longer than usual, in the way people began to listen more closely at night. There was no name for it, no single suspect, no official connection between cases that spanned cities and counties. Jurisdiction lines mattered, and information moved slowly. What happened in one town stayed in that town, at least for a while. Yet beneath the surface, something was linking these events. Families who had never met were experiencing the same unease. Investigators who worked miles apart were encountering reports that felt oddly familiar. Details repeated themselves in ways that were easy to overlook when viewed in isolation. A pattern was forming, but it had not yet been recognized. This was an era before instant communication, before shared digital databases, before the ability to compare cases across regions with a few keystrokes. Investigations relied on paper files, phone calls, and memory. Each department worked within its own boundaries, focused on what could be proven locally. And so the broader shape of the problem remained hidden. What people felt, long before it could be measured, was a loss of certainty. Suburban life had always depended on an unspoken agreement, that familiarity equaled safety, that knowing your street, your neighbors, your routine meant you were protected. These events challenged that belief. The threat did not come from somewhere distant. It did not stand out. It fit in. It moved through places designed for trust. By the time whispers of connection began to surface, the damage had already spread across multiple communities. residents began to realize that what they were experiencing was not unique. Similar stories were appearing elsewhere, told in slightly different ways, but carrying the same weight. Still, there was no single label to unite them. Without a name, it was harder to confront. Without a name, it was harder to explain. Fear remained diffuse, present, but undefined. And undefined fear has a way of settling deep into daily life. People adjusted. They installed extra locks. They changed routines. They stayed alert. But adjustment is not the same as resolution. Behind closed doors, the question lingered. How could one person move through so many neighborhoods without being noticed? How could something happen again and again, yet remain unclaimed by a single explanation? At this point in time, no one knew how long this would last. No one knew that this absence of answers would stretch not just years, but decades. That the case or cases would survive changes in technology, leadership, and public attention. The truth would wait, quietly, while communities moved forward without understanding what had passed through them. In the late 1970s, all anyone knew was this: something was wrong. It was happening in places that were supposed to be safe, and it did not yet have a name. This was the beginning of a long wait.
To understand how this case unfolded, you have to understand California in the 1970s, not as a headline, but as a way of life. This was a state still shaped by post-war optimism. Neighborhoods expanded outward in neat lines, built quickly to house families seeking space, privacy, and stability. These were not dense city blocks. They were planned communities, designed with repetition and comfort in mind. Similar houses, similar yards, similar routines. People believed in the systems around them. They trusted that neighbors would notice if something seemed off. They trusted that local institutions, schools, police departments, civic groups were close enough, familiar enough to keep problems contained. There was a strong belief that knowing your surroundings meant understanding them, and most days that belief felt justified. Homes were often left unlocked during the day. Windows were opened for airflow during warm evenings. Garages faced the street, and fences were low or decorative rather than defensive. Security systems existed, but they were uncommon and expensive. Cameras were not part of daily life. Motion sensors were rare. Safety relied more on awareness than technology. Routine was the foundation. People left for work at the same time each morning. Children walked familiar routes. Evenings followed patterns: dinner, television, lights out. Weekends brought yard work, errands, and visits with friends. The predictability of these rhythms created comfort, but it also created exposure. What no one fully appreciated at the time was how visible these routines were. In neighborhoods where everyone followed similar schedules, patterns could be observed without attracting attention. Familiarity reduced suspicion. Someone walking down the street did not stand out. Someone near a home did not immediately raise concern. Presence alone was not enough to trigger alarm. This environment made it difficult to imagine danger coming from within the landscape itself. The idea of a threat that did not break routine, that did not force entry loudly or dramatically, was difficult to process. Most people associated risk with disruption, noise, damage, confrontation. But what was unfolding did not follow those expectations. Instead, it exploited trust. California's suburban growth had created a sense of shared identity. Neighbors often recognized each other by sight, if not by name. Streets felt owned by the people who lived on them. That sense of ownership made people comfortable, but it also made them less guarded. If something seemed slightly unusual, it was often explained away. A sound outside could be a neighbor. A door left ajar could be forgetfulness. A moved object could be a mistake. These explanations were reasonable, especially in places where nothing serious had ever happened before. Law enforcement at the time reflected this structure. Police departments were local, focused on their immediate jurisdictions. Communication between agencies existed, but it was slow and limited by physical records. There were no centralized databases connecting reports across cities. Patterns that crossed county lines were difficult to detect unless someone actively searched for them. And there was no reason at first to believe such a search was necessary. Each incident appeared isolated. Each report stood on its own. Investigators addressed what they could see based on the tools and context of the era. They worked with witness statements, physical signs, and timelines built for memory rather than data. Technology did not yet provide a broader lens. Without home security footage, investigators relied on recollection. Without digital records, cross-referencing cases required time and coordination. Without DNA databases, evidence could not speak for itself in the way it can today. As a result, early warning signs were easy to miss. What residents experienced as discomfort did not immediately translate into actionable information. There was a gap between feeling unsafe and being able to explain why. That gap allowed uncertainty to grow quietly. The crimes, when they were finally connected, disrupted daily life not because they were loud, but because they were subtle. They challenged assumptions people didn't realize they were making. That safety was automatic, that familiarity equaled protection, that danger came from without, not from within. As awareness slowly increased, routines began to change. Parents listened more closely at night. Doors were checked twice. Windows were reconsidered. Yet without a clear explanation, fear remained abstract. This was not panic, it was erosion. An erosion of confidence, an erosion of certainty, an erosion of the belief that home was automatically safe. California in the 1970s was not peerless, it was trusting. And trust, once broken, changes how people see everything that follows. By the end of the decade, something had altered the relationship between residents and their surroundings. The suburbs were still there, the routines still functioned, but the comfort they once provided was compromised. And still, no one knew just how long this would last. The case had begun in a world unprepared to recognize it, and it would continue into a future shaped by the lessons learned during these years, lessons written quietly into the lives of people who never expected their neighborhoods to teach them. This was the landscape where the mystery took hold, and it would not release its grip easily.
At first, each report stood alone. A call would come in from one neighborhood, then another, miles away. Different streets, different counties, different officers taking notes, each focused on what appeared to be a local concern. The details were recorded, filed, and handled within the limits of a single jurisdiction. No one was ignoring the problem, they were responding to what they could see. But as the months passed, something began to shift. Investigators in separate counties noticed similarities that were difficult to dismiss. Not exact matches, but echoes, comparable timelines, comparable behaviors, comparable moments where residents described a sense of intrusion without immediately understanding its shape. These similarities were not obvious at first glance. They emerged slowly through repetition. One department noticed that incidents were occurring in neighborhoods with similar layouts. Another noted that reports often followed a familiar sequence of events. Another observed that certain precautions taken by residents did not seem to make a difference. Individually, these observations meant little. Together, they suggested a connection. The challenge was proving it. In the 1970s, law enforcement operated within clearly defined borders. Counties had their own records. Cities had their own systems. Information traveled by phone calls, mailed reports, and in-person meetings. There was no shared digital platform where data could be instantly compared. Recognizing a pattern required effort and initiative. An investigator had to suspect a link,
reach out to another agency, request files, and then wait. Paper records had to be copied, details had to be compared manually. Even then, differences in reporting styles could obscure similarities. What one department described one way, another described differently. And yet, the overlap became harder to ignore. Descriptions of movement, descriptions of timing, descriptions of how environments were approached. These were not identical events repeating, they were variations on a theme. As conversations began between agencies, the scope of the situation widened. What had seemed like a local issue in one place appeared again elsewhere, adjusted slightly, as if responding to new conditions. This realization marked a turning point, not because it provided answers, but because it changed the question. Instead of asking, "What happened here?" investigators began asking, "Where else has this happened?" That shift mattered. It led to the formation of early task forces, groups assembled not to solve a single case, but to understand a series of them. Detectives from different counties sat in the same rooms, spreading files across tables, reading each other's notes. They compared dates, they compared locations, they compared sequences of events, and slowly a broader picture began to form. But even with cooperation, the process was uneven. Jurisdictional boundaries still complicated everything. Authority ended at county lines. Resources varied. Some departments had more staff, more experience, more time. Others were stretched thin, responding to daily demands that left little room for long-term analysis. Coordination required compromise. Not every agency agreed on priorities. Not every lead could be pursued collectively. Decisions had to be made about where to focus limited attention. Meanwhile, the activity continued. Each new report added urgency, but also complexity. Variations raised doubts. Were these truly connected, or were investigators forcing a link where none existed? Skepticism slowed consensus, and that hesitation created space. The individual responsible understood the environment better than anyone else. Movement across counties did not draw attention if it looked ordinary. Adjusting methods reduced recognition. Avoiding repetition prevented easy identification. The gaps between agencies were not hidden, they were structural. In an era without centralized tracking, it was possible to operate between systems rather than within them, to exist in the margins of communication, to move just far enough to avoid immediate comparison. This was not a failure of effort, it was a limitation of design. Even when task forces formed, their tools were basic by today's standards. Maps were physical, timelines were handwritten. Patterns had to be visualized mentally or drawn out by hand. Every conclusion required agreement among people who did not share the same data in real time. And still, progress was made. A name was eventually attached to the series, not as an answer, but as a way to acknowledge that the incidents were connected. Naming did not solve the problem, but it made it visible. It allowed departments to speak about the same issue using the same language. That mattered, because once a pattern is recognized, it cannot be unseen. Reports that once seemed unrelated were reconsidered. Old notes were reread. Small details gained new weight. Investigators began asking different questions of witnesses, looking not just for what happened, but how it aligned with other events. But recognition did not bring resolution. Knowing that cases were connected did not reveal who was responsible. It did not explain how they moved so freely. It did not clarify how long this had been happening, or how long it might continue. What it did reveal was vulnerability. The same systems that allowed communities to function smoothly also allowed someone to pass through without detection. The same trust that made neighborhoods feel safe
made them easier to enter without challenge. This realization unsettled both residents and investigators. It suggested that the threat was not confined to one place, that it could appear anywhere with the right conditions, that familiarity itself could be a weakness. As awareness spread, coordination improved. More reports were cross-checked, but the pace of change was slow, shaped by the tools of the time. Every step forward required effort, and even then, the individual at the center of these cases remained unidentified. The pattern was clearer than ever. The path towards accountability was not. What investigators had achieved by the end of this period was understanding, not closure. They understood that this was not a series of isolated events. They understood that jurisdictional boundaries had delayed recognition. They understood that cooperation was essential but difficult. And they understood that the case would not be solved quickly. This phase marked the moment when the mystery expanded beyond any single community. It became a shared concern, stretching across regions, demanding patience and persistence. The pattern had emerged, but it would take decades for the tools to catch up with what investigators already suspected. And until then, the case would remain active in one sense and unresolved in another, waiting for a future where gaps between agencies could finally be closed.
By the time investigators began to suspect that the incidents were connected, another problem had already taken root: language. Not evidence, not effort, language. In one region, officers used a name that reflected what they were seeing locally. In another, a different label emerged, shaped by different reports, different timelines, and different concerns. Each name was meant to bring clarity. Each was intended to help officers communicate within their own departments. Instead, those names quietly divided the case. In Northern California, one title became widely used. It was descriptive, specific to that area, and tied to a cluster of reports that shared common features. Detectives there focused on patterns they could verify within their jurisdiction. They built files, timelines, and theories under that name. Further south, another name emerged. Investigators there were dealing with incidents that appeared distinct based on geography and sequence. The behaviors overlapped, but the context felt different enough to justify a separate label. Separate folders were opened, separate briefings were held. At the time, this made sense. Each department was responding to what it could see. Each name was a tool, not a conclusion. No one was trying to obscure the truth, they were trying to manage it. But names have weight. Once a label is attached, it shapes how information is sorted. Reports are categorized under headings. Evidence is grouped according to assumptions. When a new incident occurs, it is compared first to what it resembles most closely, not to what it might be connected to beyond immediate visibility. This is how fragmentation happens. A report filed under one name is not always reviewed by teams working under another. A suspect profile developed for one series is not automatically cross-checked against another. Over time, parallel investigations form, each thorough, each committed, but separated by terminology. The result was a case divided into parts. In meetings, investigators discussed their offender. In briefings, patterns were presented as region-specific. Media coverage followed suit, reinforcing the idea that these were separate threats affecting separate communities. Even as similarities persisted, the language suggested difference. This had consequences. Resources were split, strategies varied. Public awareness focused on localized warnings rather than a broader understanding of movement across regions. Residents were advised based on the name associated with their area, not the full scope of what was happening elsewhere. And the person responsible benefited from this division. Moving between regions did not just mean changing locations, it meant stepping into a different narrative, a different set of expectations, a different investigative framework. In one place, officers were looking for someone tied to a specific neighborhood layout. In another, they were focused on a different timeline. The overlap existed, but it was not always prioritized. This is not a criticism of the investigators involved. It is an illustration of how complex cases evolve when systems are not designed for seamless integration. The truth is, law enforcement in the 1970s did not have the infrastructure to instantly unify data across vast regions. Sharing required effort, and effort required certainty. Without definitive proof that these names referred to the same individual, full consolidation was difficult to justify. And proof was exactly what was missing. Witness descriptions varied, timelines overlapped imperfectly. Some behaviors appeared to change. Adaptation created doubt. Investigators asked reasonable questions. Was this escalation? Was it imitation? Was it coincidence? Language reinforced those questions. Each name carried its own assumptions. Each shaped the direction of inquiry, and each delayed the moment when all the pieces would be placed on the same table. Over time, some investigators began to challenge this separation. They noticed consistencies that transcended labels. They argued that the names might be disguising a single pattern rather than defining multiple ones. But changing a framework is not simple. It requires revisiting years of work. It requires acknowledging that earlier conclusions might be incomplete. It requires convincing multiple agencies to merge their understanding of events that occurred under different circumstances. This process took time. When connections were finally more broadly accepted, the realization was sobering. What had been treated as separate series were likely chapters of one long story. What had been divided by geography and language belonged together. By then, years had passed. The cost of that delay was not just measured in time, it was measured in missed opportunities for early recognition, in the difficulty of tracking movement across counties, in the challenge of building a single cohesive profile. Names, meant to clarify, had complicated the search. This does not mean naming was a mistake. It was a necessary step in making sense of limited information, but it reveals how powerful language can be in shaping investigations. A name can focus attention or narrow it. Once the case began to be understood as the work of one individual, the narrative shifted. Investigators could look backward with a new lens. Patterns that once seemed regional now appeared continuous. Gaps between incidents made more sense when viewed as deliberate spacing rather than unrelated pauses. But hindsight does not erase history. The years when the case existed as separate identities cannot be reclaimed. The opportunities lost during that fragmentation remain part of the story. What this phase of the investigation shows is not failure, but complexity. It shows how large-scale cases test the limits of systems built for local problems. It shows how even careful work can be shaped by the words used to describe it. And it shows how one person can exist under many names without ever being fully seen. By the time the case began to move toward unification, the individual responsible had already passed through multiple communities, leaving behind questions that would linger for decades. The names had been many, the person behind them remained unknown, and the search would have to continue. This time with the understanding that the divisions of the past would need to be overcome if the future held any chance of answers.
As the realization slowly formed that these incidents might be connected, the investigation entered a new phase, one defined not by urgency but by endurance. This was the stage where momentum met reality. Law enforcement agencies across California expanded their efforts. Detectives conducted extensive interviews, sometimes returning to the same neighborhoods multiple times. They spoke with residents, co-workers, former classmates, acquaintances, and anyone whose name surfaced through tips or circumstance. Every lead was logged, every possibility was considered, and there were many possibilities. Lists of potential suspects grew steadily. Some names appeared because of proximity, others because of prior records.
some because of small details that at the time seemed worth exploring. Each name represented a question that needed to be answered, not an assumption of guilt. Most of those questions led nowhere. Interviews ended without confirmation. Alibis checked out. Timelines failed to align. What initially appeared promising often dissolved under closer examination. Files were updated, then quietly closed. Investigators moved on to the next name, the next theory, the next call. This process repeated itself again and again. From the outside, it could look like inactivity. In reality, it was constant work, methodical, careful, and often unrewarded. Detectives followed procedures not because they expected quick results, but because thoroughness was the only responsible approach. At the same time, the limits of available tools became increasingly clear. Databases that might one day offer answers simply did not exist yet. Records were scattered across jurisdictions. Many systems were paper-based, requiring manual comparison. Even when information was shared, it moved slowly. Evidence that could be collected was preserved, but there were no usable matches within existing systems. Without a known individual to compare against, that evidence remained silent. Technology had reached a boundary. Public vigilance played a role during this period. Communities remained alert. People reported unfamiliar vehicles, unusual movements, and small changes in routine. Tip lines stayed active. Media coverage encouraged awareness without revealing investigative details that could compromise the case. Yet awareness alone could not fill the gaps. Residents did what they could with the information they had. They adjusted routines, looked out for neighbors, and shared concerns. But the responsibility for resolution did not rest with the public. It rested with systems still searching for a way forward. Investigators understood this. They continued their work, knowing that effort does not always lead to answers. They reviewed case files repeatedly, hoping that something previously overlooked might stand out with time and distance. They compared notes across departments more frequently. They challenged assumptions and reconsidered earlier conclusions. Still, no definitive breakthrough emerged. This is where many cases slow, not because of neglect, but because all immediate paths have been explored. When every lead has been followed and every available method applied, progress becomes incremental rather than dramatic. Days turn into months, months turn into years. The case did not disappear, it aged. Detectives retired or moved to other assignments. New investigators inherited files thick with history and unanswered questions. Each new team brought fresh perspective, but they were still bound by the same limitations. Without new information, there was only so much that could be done. This period required patience not just from law enforcement, but from those most affected. Families waited without timelines. Communities lived with uncertainty that had no clear endpoint. The absence of resolution did not mean the absence of care. It meant the absence of answers. And that distinction matters. Cases do not stall because people stop trying. They stall because progress depends on factors beyond determination alone. Evidence must speak. Systems must connect. Time must create opportunities that did not exist before. During this stage, investigators made a choice that is rarely acknowledged. They chose to preserve rather than abandon. Files were maintained. Evidence was stored carefully. Notes were organized with the understanding that someone else, someday, might see what they could not. This was an investment in the future. The work became quieter, but it did not stop. Periodic reviews ensured that the case remained active in principle, even if new leads were scarce. When technology advanced, evidence was re-examined. When new methods emerged, they were evaluated cautiously. But for now, there were no usable matches, no confirmed suspects,
no moment that allowed the case to move forward. This is the reality of long investigations. They are not defined by constant breakthroughs. They're defined by persistence during silence, by the willingness to hold on to unanswered questions without forcing conclusions. The public measures success by resolution. Investigators measure it by responsibility, by ensuring that when answers do come, they are reliable. In this phase, restraint was as important as action. Speculation could not replace proof. Assumptions could not stand in for verification. Every decision had to withstand future scrutiny, even if that future felt distant. So the case remained open, not in urgency, but in readiness. Waiting is not passive in investigations like this. It is a form of preparation. It is the recognition that some answers require conditions that have not yet arrived. And while time moved forward, the work paused, not in defeat, but in anticipation. Because even when a case reaches a standstill, it is not finished. It is simply waiting for the moment when effort and opportunity finally intersect.
Then, without warning, the pattern seemed to end. Reports slowed, then stopped. The calls that had once arrived with troubling regularity no longer came in. Weeks passed, then months. Eventually, years. There was no announcement, no explanation, no arrest that could mark a clear turning point. Just silence. For investigators, this absence raised as many questions as the crimes themselves. When activity suddenly ceases without resolution, it does not provide comfort. It creates uncertainty. It forces every possibility to remain open. Had the person responsible moved away? Had circumstances changed? Had age, injury, or life events altered behavior? Or had the actions simply ended without explanation? There was no way to know. Without confirmation, the silence could not be interpreted as closure. It could not be celebrated as success. It existed in a space between relief and unease, where answers were missing, but the impact remained. For law enforcement, the work did not stop simply because reports stopped. Case files remained open, evidence stayed preserved. Investigators continued to review materials, even as new information became scarce. But momentum is difficult to sustain without new input. The absence of new crimes removed urgency from the public eye, even though the underlying questions remained unresolved. Media attention faded, resources were reassigned, new cases demanded immediate focus. And yet, this one never truly went away. It lingered in offices, in storage rooms, in conversations between colleagues who had worked the case during its most active years. It became part of institutional memory, a reminder of something unfinished. For families affected, the silence carried a different weight. There were no updates to hold on to, no developments to interpret. Time moved forward without explanation, leaving questions unanswered year after year. Waiting became a permanent state rather than a temporary one. Not knowing can be harder than receiving difficult news. Without confirmation, families were left to live between possibilities. Every unanswered question remained open. Every memory became a reminder of what had not been resolved. Communities experienced their own version of this uncertainty. On the surface, life returned to routine. Neighborhoods continued to grow. New families moved in, unaware of what had once occurred there. Streets that had once been discussed in whispers became ordinary again. But for those who remembered, the absence of explanation never fully faded. Silence does not erase experience. It only removes the structure around it. The lack of new incidents did not mean the danger had been understood. It meant only that nothing new was visible. That distinction mattered deeply to those who had lived through the earlier years. Some residents found reassurance in the passage of time. Others remained cautious, aware that unresolved cases do not offer guarantees. For investigators, the psychological challenge of this phase was significant. They were trained to respond, to act, to pursue leads. Silence offered none of that. It demanded patience without progress, vigilance without direction. Cases like this do not allow for a sense of completion. They remain mentally present even when inactive. Each new tip, no matter how small, was still evaluated. Each new method was still considered. But without new information, movement was slow. This period tested professional discipline. It required investigators to resist speculation, to avoid forcing conclusions, and to remain ready for developments that might never come. The silence also reshaped how the case was viewed. Over time, it shifted from an active investigation to a lingering question, from immediate concern to unresolved history. This transition did not reduce its importance, it changed its role. The case became a benchmark, a reminder of limits, a quiet measure of how much remained unknown. For those directly affected, time did not bring distance. Anniversaries continued to arrive, memories remained vivid. The lack of resolution became part of daily life rather than an interruption to it. Silence in this context was not peaceful. It carried uncertainty. It carried unfinished thoughts. It carried the awareness that something significant had occurred without explanation. And yet, silence also preserved possibility. As long as there was no conclusion, the case remained open to future understanding. Evidence remained intact. Questions remained valid. The absence of answers meant that answers could still exist. This is the paradox of unresolved cases. They rest quietly, but they are never truly dormant. They wait for new tools, new perspectives, or new connections that did not exist before. The end of activity did not mark the end of significance. It marked the beginning of a long pause, one defined not by inactivity, but by anticipation. Because silence in cases like this is not an ending. It is a space where time passes, but the questions remain, and where the absence of noise does not mean the absence of meaning. While the case grew quiet in public view, something important remained carefully untouched. Evidence. Collected years earlier, sealed, labeled, and stored according to the standards of its time, it sat in controlled environments, unchanged by headlines or fading attention. It did not speak, it did not point, but it endured. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, investigators gathered what they could using the tools available to them. Physical materials were logged, items were cataloged, reports were written with precision and restraint. Nothing suggested that decades later, these same materials would hold answers that science had not yet learned how to read. At the time, forensic science was reliable, but limited. Investigators relied on blood type grouping, trace comparisons, and witness accounts. These methods could narrow possibilities, but they could not isolate one individual from millions. The idea that identity could be mapped through genetic markers was still years away from practical use. What mattered most, though, was not what could be done then, but what was preserved for later. Evidence storage was not glamorous work. It required discipline rather than discovery. Boxes were logged and moved into evidence rooms. Temperature controls were monitored. Chain of custody records were maintained, sometimes by people who never worked the case directly. Preservation is an act of patience. At the time, no one could say with certainty that future science would unlock new meaning from these materials, but they understood something fundamental. Once lost, evidence cannot be recovered. As years passed, forensic science changed quietly, steadily, and without fanfare. The first forms of DNA profiling emerged in the mid-1980s. Early techniques could compare samples, but they required large quantities and pristine conditions. Results took time and were not always conclusive. Databases were small or non-existent. Matches were rare. For many older cases, early DNA methods simply did not apply. The science was promising but incomplete. Investigators who revisited long-standing cases during this era often found that evidence could not yet answer their questions. Samples might be too degraded, techniques might be too broad, results might confirm only what was already known. And so, many cases remained unchanged, not because of neglect, but because the tools were still catching up. Time, however, continued to move forward. By the 1990s and early 2000s, DNA profiling became more refined. Smaller samples could be analyzed, results became more specific, national databases expanded. The concept of identifying an individual through genetic material became not just possible, but reliable. Still, even with these advances, many cases remained unresolved. DNA databases depended on known profiles. If the person responsible had never submitted a sample through arrest or testing, there was nothing to match against. The science could extract information, but it could not create a name out of thin air. Evidence could speak, but only if someone was listening from the other end. What changed everything was not just better analysis, but a new way of thinking about identification. Investigators began to understand that genetic material did more than identify individuals. It revealed relationships, patterns, connections that extended outward through families rather than inward toward a single match. This idea transformed the meaning of preserved evidence. What once waited for a direct comparison could now be used to trace a network. Distant connections became valuable. Partial matches became starting points rather than dead ends. But none of this would have been possible without careful preservation. Evidence that had been handled correctly decades earlier remained viable. Samples that had been protected from contamination still carried usable information. Documentation that had been maintained allowed modern analysts to trust what they were examining. This is where time altered meaning. An item collected in one era gained new significance in another. What was once inconclusive became informative. What once raised questions could now suggest direction. The evidence itself had not changed, the world around it had. For investigators revisiting the case, this realization brought renewed purpose. The quiet years had not been wasted. They had allowed science to mature. They had allowed methods to evolve. They had allowed possibility to grow. Evidence, unlike memory, does not fade if it is cared for properly. It waits. It waits through changes in leadership, through shifts in public attention, through technological revolutions. It remains steady while interpretation changes. This waiting is not passive, it is potential held in reserve. Each preserved item represented a bridge between eras, a link connecting early investigative work with modern analysis, a reminder that diligence in the past can create opportunity in the future. For cases that had stalled, this was a profound shift. Time was no longer the enemy alone. It had become an ally. The same years that once widened the gap between questions and answers now closed it. Advances that could not have been imagined in the original investigation became available, precise, and dependable. Evidence that had outlived one investigative generation was now ready to speak to another. This moment marked a turning point, not in resolution, but in readiness. The case was no longer waiting for activity to resume. It was waiting for interpretation to change. And when science finally reached the point where preserved evidence could be fully understood, the silence that had followed the crimes began to feel less like an ending and more like a pause before clarity. Because some answers are not missing, they are simply waiting for the right moment to be understood.
For decades, investigators searched for a name that matched the evidence. They checked databases, they reviewed lists, they waited for a direct connection that never arrived. Then the approach changed. Not by abandoning DNA, but by asking a different question. Genetic genealogy is not traditional DNA matching. It does not begin with the assumption that the individual responsible is already known to the system. Instead, it accepts a simple reality. People are connected. Every person belongs to a wider biological network that extends backward through parents, grandparents, and generations before them. This method does not search for a person, it searches for relationships. Standard DNA profiling compares a genetic sample against profiles stored in criminal databases. If there's a match, investigators can move forward quickly. If there's no match, the process often stops there. Genetic genealogy works differently. It compares genetic markers from evidence to profiles voluntarily uploaded to public genealogy databases by individuals interested in learning about their ancestry. These people are not suspects. They are participants in family research. They upload their DNA to learn where their ancestors came from or to connect with distant relatives. What investigators receive is not a name, but a set of partial connections. A distant cousin, a shared great-grandparent, a branch of a family tree. At first, this information may seem too broad to be useful, but when handled carefully, it becomes a map. Each genetic match points toward a common ancestor. By building outward from that point, genealogists can reconstruct extended family trees. They use public records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, census data, and obituaries. Everything they consult is legally accessible information. This process is methodical and slow. Family trees grow sideways before they narrow. Many names are ruled out. Timelines are checked. Locations are compared. Ages are considered. Occupations are reviewed. The goal is not to accuse, but to eliminate. Most branches lead nowhere. Some overlap in unexpected ways. Gradually, a smaller pool begins to form. This is why distant relatives mattered. A close relative might never have submitted DNA to a public database, but a third cousin or a second cousin once removed might have. That distant connection is enough to identify a shared ancestor and begin tracing forward. This approach requires discipline and oversight. Genetic genealogy operates within legal and ethical boundaries. Investigators follow strict protocols. They use databases that allow law enforcement access under specific conditions. They work with professional genealogists who understand both science and privacy responsibilities. The data is not used to make arrests. It is used to generate leads. Every potential identification must still be confirmed through traditional investigative methods: independent DNA testing, legal warrants, verified records. Nothing moves forward without corroboration. This distinction is essential. Genetic genealogy does not replace due process, it supports it. The reason this method changed cold cases forever is not because it is faster, but because it is broader. It does not rely on prior contact with the justice system. It does not assume visibility. It accounts for the possibility that a person lived an ordinary life, avoided attention, and left no official record behind. It recognizes that identity is not isolated, it is inherited. When investigators began applying genetic genealogy to long-standing cases, the impact was immediate. Cases that had stalled for decades gained movement. Evidence that once had no clear endpoint suddenly had direction. What had been silent began to suggest pathways. Family trees became investigative tools, not because families were responsible, but because biology leaves patterns that time cannot erase. Each generation carries markers forward. Each connection adds context. This process required collaboration between disciplines that had rarely intersected before: law enforcement, forensic scientists, genealogists, legal advisors, all working within defined boundaries. Transparency mattered. Policies were established to govern when and how genetic genealogy could be used. Oversight ensured that the method was reserved for serious cases. Consent settings within databases were respected. Public trust became part of the process. This careful framework allowed the method to be effective without being intrusive. It also reshaped expectations. Cold cases were no longer limited by the absence of witnesses or confessions. They were no longer dependent solely on chance encounters or delayed tips. They could now be revisited with a structured approach that acknowledged both science and responsibility. The shift was not dramatic in appearance. There were no sudden announcements, no immediate conclusions, just quiet work, careful analysis, incremental narrowing. And through it all, the evidence remained the same. What changed was how it was read. Genetic genealogy did not promise certainty at the beginning. It offered possibility. It turned questions into processes. It allowed investigators to move forward without making assumptions. Most importantly, it demonstrated that time does not diminish relevance. It reframes it. A sample collected decades earlier could now reveal connections that were impossible to see before. A case once considered stalled could be re-entered with clarity rather than frustration. This method did not solve every case, but it changed what was considered solvable.